I overheard him telling his friend, "She's just a body to me," and his face turned pale the moment I stepped into the room. I'm Eloise, 28 years old, living in Arizona. My husband, well, soon-to-be ex-husband, his name is Carter and he's 30. I truly believed we had the perfect relationship when we first got married, but now I'm sitting here, completely shocked at how quickly everything fell apart. In the beginning, everything felt fresh and secure. I was used to a comfortable lifestyle before meeting Carter, since my parents never made me worry about money. Carter, on the other hand, grew up in a more humble environment. He talked about times when his family had to budget carefully, so he learned to be cautious with finances. But when we met, he never let that difference become an issue. I liked him because he was dependable and kind, completely different from the unreliable guys I had dated before. We got a small apartment, not fancy, but affordable and in a decent neighborhood, and settled into our daily routine. He worked a regular office job handling administrative tasks and assisting with design work, while I jumped from one receptionist job to another, never staying in one place for too long. I'd always tell him I was looking for something better, and at first, he never pressured me about it. Back then, he used to do little romantic things that made me feel special. If I had a bad day, he'd surprise me with my favorite takeout. If I mentioned a sale, he'd casually say, "Go ahead, treat yourself, babe." In the first few months of our marriage, I thought, this is exactly how a husband should be, I won't lie. I loved that he never questioned my spending. I wasn't reckless, but I never really thought about budgets. My parents had raised me to believe that money was always available when you needed something. It's not like I was splurging on designer handbags every week. But if I wanted a new outfit, I bought it. If I wanted to dine somewhere upscale, I convinced Carter we deserved a date night. He used to look at me so affectionately when we went out. I remember one particular night. We had a lovely dinner, and he held my hand all the way back to the car. I thought, this is the man I'm spending my life with. It felt safe, comforting, like nothing could go wrong. Looking back, I ignored the signs. Sometimes, when I'd pull out our joint card, I'd notice him doing quick mental calculations before sighing. But since he never made a big deal about it, I dismissed it. I told myself he was just being cautious, or maybe he had a bit of a frugal streak. I figured he'd get used to my way of doing things eventually. For a while, we were in the honeymoon phase. Our families thought we were perfect together. My mom adored Carter because he was polite and always helpful when we visited. His parents liked me too, but they'd occasionally drop hints like, "Make sure you both are saving for the future." I'd smile and nod, not really taking it seriously. I think Carter's dad even tried teaching us about financial management, but I found it dull. Carter, however, paid attention, but he never pushed it on me. It never seemed important. He was content handling the finances quietly while I enjoyed life. A year into our marriage, cracks began to show. I quit another job because I was bored. Carter gently suggested that I try to stick with one job for a while so we could plan better financially. I laughed it off, telling him I was too smart to waste my time answering phones all day. He tried to be supportive, but I could tell it bothered him. My mood swings got worse, and if I felt like he was criticizing me, I'd snap at him. Our arguments became more frequent, about groceries, apartment purchases, and little things I considered essential, but he insisted we wait on. He'd say, "Let's hold off until payday," and I'd roll my eyes, calling him cheap. Sometimes, I'd even ask why he wasn't earning more if he expected me to wait on something so small. I won't pretend I wasn't comparing our life to other couples on social media. I wasn't obsessed, but I'd occasionally check and see my friends going on vacations, upgrading to bigger apartments, and treating themselves. I started pestering Carter about why we weren't making progress. He always reminded me we had bills, credit card payments, the usual responsibilities. I knew that, but I still felt frustrated that he wasn't doing more to give me the life I wanted. If I'm being completely honest, I never thought of it as my responsibility. In my mind, providing was the husband's job. I'd say, My parents never made me worry about money, and he'd respond, "Well, that's nice, but I'm not your parents." Sometimes I push him too far. He'd get quiet, not ignoring me completely, but answering in short responses and avoiding eye contact. That frustrated me even more because I expected him to keep showering me with attention. When he didn't, I'd threaten to pack my bags or call my mom, hoping to snap him out of it. And sure enough, he'd eventually apologize for not being in a better mood. It became a pattern. I'd explode, he'd withdraw, I'd threaten to leave, and he'd calm me down. Financially, things got worse. Since I wasn't working consistently, the bills fell on him. He was under pressure, but he rarely lashed out at me. Maybe he'd shake his head or mumble something under his breath, but he never confronted me directly. And since he wasn't bringing it up, I convinced myself everything was fine. I was too focused on getting what I thought I deserved to notice the stress piling up inside him. The few times I attempted job hunting, I'd come back complaining that no one appreciated my skills. Carter would offer tips on improving my resume or interview technique, but I found it condescending, like he thought I wasn't capable. For another year, we carried on like this. We had small fights about grocery shopping, electricity bills, and how often we ate out. I still didn't see it as my responsibility. In my head, that was the husband's job, to provide while I enjoyed life. Looking back, I realize how selfish that was, but at the time, I genuinely believed it. Carter must have hoped I'd eventually mature. He swallowed his frustration, maybe vented to his friend, or scribbled notes in his little budget notebook. I never asked what was in it. I just saw him writing sometimes at the kitchen table, looking exhausted. Emotionally, we drifted apart. I could feel him pulling away, but I assumed it was just a phase. He stayed late at work, always saying he had deadlines. When he came home, he barely spoke, looking completely drained. I tried getting his attention in small ways. Sometimes, I'd cuddle up to him in bed, but he'd say he was too tired. Other times, I'd plan a fun night out, but he'd mumble something about the cost. Eventually, I started using the same old trick. I'd threaten to leave, expecting him to beg me to stay. And usually he did. He'd say, "Don't talk like that," or remind me how much he loved me. That was enough to make me back off for a while. Looking back, I realized I was using his fear of losing me to keep him in line. I didn't actually want to leave. I just used it whenever I felt criticized. Then one evening, everything changed. The separation process moved fast. Carter was done. No second guesses. He froze our joint accounts so we could split the funds. I was livid. I needed money for rent, but I couldn't just dip into our shared finances anymore. Reality was finally hitting me. I had lost him. Carter had already withdrawn his portion, leaving me with a fraction of the funds. Nowhere near enough to sustain my usual lifestyle. That was my first real taste of financial independence in years, and it unsettled me to my core. Desperate, I called him, pleading for an extension, asking if he could cover the last month's rent. He agreed, but only if we put it in writing that I'd reimburse him. I was stunned by how rigid he had become. He had never been this unyielding before. In that moment, resentment flared up inside me, but beneath it, I recognized the truth. He was resolute about severing ties. As a last-ditch effort, I tried an emotional appeal, telling him I still cared for him and that we could salvage our relationship if he just returned home. I even promised to start applying for full-time jobs, to commit to a structured financial plan. His reply was ice cold. "I needed that months ago. You're only saying it now because you're desperate." Then he dropped the final blow. He had already signed a lease for a modest place of his own. That revelation crushed any lingering hope I had. I collapsed onto the couch, tears streaming down my face. I wasn't even sure if I was mourning the loss of him or the loss of my security. When my family intervened, it wasn't in the way I had anticipated. My father, who had always been my financial safety net, said he would bail me out one final time. After that, I was on my own. He wanted me to learn a hard lesson about accountability. My mother echoed his sentiment. They weren't heartless. They didn't want me to end up destitute. But they also recognized that I had driven Carter away. I felt abandoned, as if no one was in my corner. But looking back, I suppose they saw what I had refused to acknowledge. Carter had fought harder for our marriage than I ever did. The legal proceedings were swift. Since we had no children or significant shared assets beyond the accounts we had already closed, the divorce was straightforward. It happened so quickly. One moment, I was a married woman who thought she had all the power, and the next, I was signing documents that officially ended it all. I had always boasted about having a devoted husband who would do anything for me. Now, I was humiliated, having to admit that we were over. I won't lie. Part of me still blames him for not toughing it out, for not earning more, for failing to meet my every expectation. But another part of me, the one that emerges in quiet, unguarded moments, admits that I never treated him like a true partner. If I'm being brutally honest, I saw him as a financial crutch more than anything else. I didn't recognize it fully back then, but revisiting our arguments, I can't deny that I hurled cruel words at him, pushing him further away each time. He tried to communicate his feelings, but I was too engrossed in my own demands to listen. And when he finally reached his breaking point, there was no turning back. Now, I sit in this half-empty apartment, trying to figure out what comes next. It's strange not having Carter around, even though I was the one who constantly threatened to leave first. I keep expecting him to walk through the door after work, asking about my day, as if none of this ever happened. But I know the truth, he's not coming back. He took most of his things, and the emptiness of the space only makes his absence more palpable. Some days, I cry in frustration. Other times, I just feel numb. I'm learning the painful reality that once you push someone past their limits, you can't lure them back with the same tired tactics. If I'm being completely transparent, I still struggle to accept full accountability. Part of me insists that if he truly loved me, he would have fought harder for us. But deep down, I know I gave him little reason to stay. I treated him like he was disposable. I regret how things unfolded. Not necessarily because I grasped the extent of my faults, though I'm starting to see glimpses, but because the aftermath is so inconvenient and humiliating. Now, I'm left footing the rent alone, drowning in maxed-out credit cards, and navigating an unexpected divorce in my late 20s. I never envisioned this for myself. People glance at me with either pity or judgment, and I despise both reactions. Meanwhile, Carter seems unburdened, at least according to his mother. She told me he's finally sleeping better, that he looks less stressed. I replay that moment constantly. The night I overheard him on the phone, saying I was just a body to him, that he had married the wrong person. I can still hear the bitter, hollow laugh that followed. Every time I think about it, it stings. But what stings more is knowing that he meant every word. He wasn't just venting to a friend to blow off steam. He was speaking a truth he had kept buried for a long time. And when I confronted him, he didn't even try to deny it. That's when I realized I had lost all control. No matter how many times I had threatened to leave, he was the one who actually walked away. Now, I'm left with a whirlwind of thoughts. Is it fair to say this is entirely my fault? I don't know. I don't think Carter was flawless either. Maybe he should have been more vocal sooner, instead of bottling everything up. But if I strip away my pride, I have to admit that I was the one who pushed him to the edge, and he finally leapt. And that's what happens when you treat someone like they're obligated to tolerate your behavior. Eventually, they realize they're not obligated at all. So, that's my story. I overheard my husband tell his friend I was just a body to him. And in that moment, I watched my marriage disintegrate. I remember the expression on his face, drained, resolute, completely finished. If you ask me if I regret it, my answer is yes. But not because I've fully confronted my mistakes. I regret it because I despise dealing with the consequences. I'm left to gather the fragments of a life I failed to appreciate. And now, Carter is gone. And the worst part, I wasn't the one who left. I just pushed him so far that he had no reason to stay. That's what happens when you believe you hold all the power, but forget that people have limits. Once they're done, no amount of pleading or remorse can bring them back. Carter came home late again. I was sitting there, waiting for him to start dinner. I was already furious because he hadn't texted me back in time. I had messaged him around 5 p.m., and he only responded at 6:30 with a simple, "In a meeting. See you soon." When he finally walked in, I was ready to explode until I realized he was on the phone. I overheard him say, "I don't know, man. I'm just exhausted." Curious, I crept closer, trying to listen without interrupting. Then I heard him sigh and say, "Honestly, I wish I hadn't married her. I felt like I had ended up with the wrong person." My body froze, and my heart pounded in my chest, because I had never heard him say anything remotely close to that before. Then he continued, "It's like she's just there. A body, you know? She doesn't care about me. She just wants a lifestyle I can't sustain." My stomach twisted into knots. I stood rooted to the spot, absolutely livid. Who the heck did he think he was to say that about me? But beneath the fury, a strange chill settled over me because of how he spoke. He wasn't ranting, wasn't shouting. He was just finished. The way he said it was so final, so emotionless, like a man who had already given up. Then I heard him let out this short, bitter chuckle, as if he were laughing at his own misery. I couldn't stand it. I stormed into the room, and as soon as he saw me, the color drained from his face. He quickly mumbled, "I gotta go," to whoever was on the other end and ended the call. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was suffocating, like our entire marriage was unraveling right in front of us. Then I demanded, "What did you mean by that? You regret marrying me?" He exhaled heavily and said, "Eloise, I'm exhausted. You're always complaining. You don't care about how I feel. I'm just done." I was stunned. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't trying to backtrack. He was stating a fact. And it stung. My face burned as I snapped. Done with what? Trying to be a decent husband? He met my eyes, his face unreadable. "I've tried," he said simply. "But you don't listen. You don't respect me." I lost it. I started shouting about how ungrateful he was, how I was the best thing that had ever happened to him. If he wanted out, he should just say so. I even threatened to leave that night, expecting him to panic like he always did. But this time, he just shrugged. He actually said, "Maybe you should." That threw me. I had never seen him so blunt before. It only fueled my rage, so I unleashed everything on him, accusing him of being lazy, unsupportive, not working hard enough to provide for me. He just stood there, arms crossed, shaking his head. Tears stung my eyes because deep down I realized something terrifying. I was losing control. He didn't look scared. He didn't look guilty. He looked drained, completely fed up. I glared at him and hissed, "If you ever call me just a body again, I'm gone for good." He stared right back and said, "Eloise, you've been emotionally gone for a long time. You only care about what I can give you." I wanted to slap him, not physically but with words, to hurt him the way he was hurting me. "You're pathetic. You can't even handle providing for your wife," I spat. He didn't even flinch. He just said, "I'm not your bank, and I'm not your punching bag." I had never heard him talk to me like that. It was so final. My heart pounded because, in that instant, I knew we weren't going back to normal after a couple of days. This was a breaking point. Then he walked out of the room and started shoving clothes into a suitcase. I was stunned. He was actually leaving. My anger turned into panic. "You're overreacting. You're being ridiculous," I yelled. He didn't stop packing. "I'll stay at my friend's place for a while," he said. The same friend he had just been on the phone with, I assumed. I shouted after him, demanding how he could do this to me, if he even cared about our marriage. His response cut through me like a blade. "You cared more about threatening to leave than actually fixing anything. Now I'm done. Those words stung because I knew, deep down, he had probably been thinking this for a long time, waiting for me to change. And I never did. He left that night, slamming the door behind him. At first, I was sure he'd be back after cooling off. He'd done that before. Maybe gone for a drive or crashed at a friend's house for a few hours. But this time felt different. The apartment felt emptier than usual, and I started to panic. I tried texting him, but he didn't reply. I tried calling, but it rang and rang before going to voicemail. I was furious. How dare he ignore me? But at the same time, a terrifying thought crept in. What if he really doesn't come back? The next morning, I woke up to no missed calls. I reached out again, nothing. By midday, I decided to call his friend, but he just said Carter didn't want to speak to me yet. That stung. So I called my sister Bethany and unloaded everything. She wasn't surprised. "Eloise, I saw this coming," she said. "Carter's been miserable for a while." I snapped at her for saying that, but deep down, I knew she was right. She sighed and said, "You need to realize that you've been pushing him away. Maybe this time, you pushed too far." I was still stubborn. He just can't handle me. If he had given me what I needed, we wouldn't be here. She paused and said something that made my stomach twist. "Can you hear yourself? You can't blame him for everything. You're always expecting more." That shut me up. I hung up feeling both furious at her and unsettled by the truth she was hinting at. I still didn't want to admit I had done anything wrong. I kept telling myself Carter was weak, that he should have been a stronger provider instead of whining about money. But I couldn't shake the nagging thought that maybe, just maybe, I had taken advantage of him. Days passed, and Carter still hadn't reached out. Panic started setting in. I left him messages. "Please come home so we can talk," or "I'm sorry. Let's figure this out." But he stayed silent. Then his mother called me, her voice polite yet sad. Carter asked me to store some of his stuff temporarily. My chest tightened. Was he getting ready to leave me for good? My mind raced, scrambling for a way to fix things, without actually admitting fault. Because, let's be real, I still saw myself as the victim. A week later, Carter finally texted me. "We need to talk about separating finances. I'm planning to file for divorce." That message hit me like a wrecking ball. My stomach knotted and my hands shook. I couldn't believe he was serious. I had threatened to leave so many times, but I never meant it. Now he was the one walking away for real. I tried calling. He didn't answer. So I shot off a text. "You're being irrational. We should do counseling or something." His reply was brutal. "It's too late. I've tried talking to you about this so many times, and you never cared." I read that message at least 10 times, feeling a mix of anger, hurt, and disbelief. I told my mom, expecting her to take my side, but she just sighed. "Honey, you need to grow up. You can't keep expecting him to pay for everything and ignore his feelings." That irritated me, but deep down, I knew she was right.